Good morning, everybody, or perhaps good afternoon, depending on where you are. We are in our webinar, Is Freeze Drying the Right Fit? How to Evaluate Trade-offs Before You Scale. So if you're on the wrong flight, this is the time that you want to go to your next gate. I am today's moderator. I'm Lisa Keefe, and I am a lifelong business writer who most recently has been covering the food industry. For a couple of decades, I was the editor-in-chief of Meeting Place, and I am still a contributing editor to that publication. So that's me. A few housekeeping notes before I introduce the star of our show. If for questions during the webinar, which we are happy to answer, please use that chat button that's down at the bottom of your screen. And for for those of you who are wondering about a recording, there is going to be a recording available for FPSA members. And if you are a registrant and not an FPSA member, shame on you, but you will also get a link in order to view the webinar after the fact. Now, I have the pleasure of introducing you all to Matt Graunke. Matt is a sales executive with Parker Freeze Dry. He's been working in this part of the business since before the pandemic, and he has expertise in all types of freeze drying, including pet and human food, biotechnology, and agriculture. He's also worked with clients from kitchen entrepreneurs to large industrial producers with throughputs of up to 38 tons of product a day. So wherever you are in your journey, Matt has been there. He's also addressed the freeze-dried market for dozens of audiences, from trade shows to universities. So we are happy to have him here today, and he brings a practical perspective on how companies evaluate, implement, and improve freeze-drying operations. And good morning, Matt. How are you?
I'm great, Lisa. Thanks for having me today.
Oh, happy to have you join us. Did I leave anything out in the introduction?
No, I think you covered it.
Covered everything.
Yeah.
Terrific. Well, I want to start with a little bit of backgrounding. I have been reading a little bit about this, and certainly the market for freeze-dried goods is growing at a compound annual growth rate of nearly 7% globally. Or if you're talking about Asia Pacific, just about 10% annually. What is behind that impressive demand?
There's a lot going on. Right
Mhm.
now, the technology is not new by any means, but it's becoming more mainstream and more people are becoming aware of it. And with that, we're learning more and more about, what's capable. And with that, then we're getting the innovators and the creators starting to think, what can we do that people aren't talking about yet? So it's been a real exciting time to be a part of it. Whether it's shelf stability, as we're showing here, freeze drying takes your moisture content down to incredible levels not achievable by traditional dehydration methods. And we can also get water activity down to levels that create incredible shelf stability when combined with proper packaging and proper care after the process.
Mhm.
Premium products, the process itself is fairly gentle, so we're able to really retain nutrients and flavors and aromas and things like that. So that creates a lot of attraction. And then lastly, depending on the field that you're in pet in particular, the margins, because you're able to use materials that aren't quite at the same level of what you would see as human consumption in the grocery store, but there's an
Mhm.
incredible value add when it comes to, the freeze dry side of things in the animal space.
Oh, definitely. I mean, the savings in shipping when you take the water out, and
Oh
also,
gosh, yeah,
um, there's such a focus on reducing food waste in the
sure.
home these days, and so something that is shelf stable is very popular.
For
That having been said, well, not all products are suitable for freeze drying. Maybe
yeah.
we want to look at the next slide and walk us through a little bit of the characteristics of a product that make it a candidate for being freeze dried.
Well, one of the things you need to really watch for is things that are high in sugars tend to not freeze dry well at all. You have to be,
Why is that, Matt? Can you help me
that's
understand?
um, that's going to be a good answer for someone more on the science back side of things, but
Okay.
ultimately what ends up happening is the freezing point changes. So a good example is like honey, maple
Okay.
syrup. I mean, it's the natural sugars inside there. It's very difficult to get it to freeze to a point where it stays solid. That moisture that's in there stays solid, and when you draw something under vacuum that is not solid, it's going to tear it apart. And
Mm.
what happened in one instance where I was working with just some maple syrup and we were just experimenting a little bit, it basically would just 10, 12 times the size and turn into what looked like coral under the vacuum temperature because it had boiled up and then changed its phase of matter. So,
Okay, that's a little bit of science craziness, but I bet it was fun to watch.
yeah, not fun to
Let's
clean
go.
though.
Oh, I bet. Well, let's go back to what characteristics make a product suitable for freeze
Yeah,
drying.
for sure, for sure. So if you've got something that you want to, you've got high nutrition content and you need to preserve that, and uh, animal proteins, fantastic for freeze drying, whether that's offal, whether that's human grade meats that you're putting into your pet foods. Those are great candidates if they're prepared properly. You want high surface area. So we aren't going to take a whole chicken breast and put it in a freeze dryer. That's not very efficient. It takes a very long time for that heat to get all the way to the center. But if we were to take that same chicken breast and then dice it into morsel sizes, bite-sized pieces for your pets, that process is under a day. So you know that's one of the things you need to consider. Things that are put into a slurry form, if you've got like a formulation, a mixture, that's a lot of
Hmm.
surface area. So it sublimates a little better when there is more surface area as opposed to just having giant pieces of whatever it is that you're processing.
I see. Well, I want to talk a little bit, and we can move to the next slide. What would you say is the value equation here? We can talk about things being suitable, but that doesn't mean
Yeah,
just because you can doesn't mean you should, as you say.
yeah,
What about what elements are you bringing into a value equation? I mean, the cost of ingredients, the price you get for the finished product, um, but what weighs most heavily, and
yeah.
there are several factors, and how do you weigh them all out?
This is a giant can of worms, but the key things you want to be watching for is what's your yield. So when we remove all the moisture, what's left? And then in simplest forms, what can we sell that for? And how does that compare to everything else? So it all has to kind of work together. If you have something that is an incredibly low yield, like you're dealing with, 95% water, this may not have the 95% water being removed. You may not have enough left to sell after the fact at a decent value to cover the cost of the processes or the production, things like that. So that's one of the things you need to think about when you're doing that. I mean, if you think about it at a regular grocery store and with most products, anything being sold by weight, you're really just kind of paying for a lot of water for the most part. And when you take that out of the equation, you need to make sure um, that it makes sense to still
Mhm.
operate that way.
So are there types of products that just have too much water in them, and once you take the water out, there's just like nothing left?
Yeah, I mean, there's just different formulations and things. You don't see that too much in the pet space and in animal nutrition as you see in like biotech
Right.
when people are working with different formulations and things like that. So, um, as far as a rule of thumb, usually solids, you're probably looking 35, 45% yield, when it comes to
Hmm.
animal proteins. So it's pretty safe there. What you got to watch though is these animal proteins, how much fat is in there. That's going to have an effect on your end results as well.
Oh,
Fat
okay.
doesn't sublimate either, so it's exceptionally difficult.
I imagine what you're left with when you have something that's too fatty and it's been freeze dried is probably pretty unappetizing.
Yeah, it doesn't always look the same as everything else that's in there. It's got a different texture. It's still retaining moisture. It provides risks for oxidation down the road.
Hmm.
Really has negative effects on the rest of the process.
Well, it's with all these factors in play, when a potential client comes to you, I mean, they usually come to you with some assumptions about how this will work or benefit them. What do you hear most often that is incorrect on the part of those who ask you about this?
I think the biggest thing that we hear that usually we kind of got to back it up a little bit and start from square one is when they talk about continuous freeze dry because it doesn't it's not continuous. It's a batch process. We need vacuums. We have to close the doors. So a lot of people come in from traditional food production spaces that are used to conveyors flying and zipping through ovens and zipping through freezers and
Hmm.
zipping through every part of the process and to kind of shift your mind to that mindset that okay, we need to close the door and it's going to take a little bit of time to do this. So we get to work through that challenge pretty frequently and it's an easily solvable problem. It just
Hmm.
involves you know real strategic scheduling across uh, multiple batches so that you can feed the downstream that's continuous and you can accept the upstream that's continuous because you have enough space to run multiple different batches on a very specific schedule so that it's seamless from one end to the other. But that's probably
Hmm.
the biggest misconception. And maybe misconception isn't really the right word for it because we do get a lot of calls of just creatives and entrepreneurs and innovators just going, hey, what'll happen if we do this? And that's part of what makes this industry so interesting right now because there's still a lot of things that haven't been tried yet. So there's always something new going on that we can say, you know what? Let's see what happens.
I was going to say you probably have an awful lot of invite an awful lot of folks into your test kitchens and just give it a shot and see what happens.
Right, right. Because then you're dealing with what do we know instead of what do we think we know. And then you can make even better decisions from there. I mean, we do have the ability to operate test runs and test batches at a pilot scale to kind of prove it out and allow you to really understand what you could expect at a much larger scale when you're talking about tons per day instead of just a single batch in your lab.
Hmm. Well, Matt, what would be an example of a pilot run that you did, and you were like, we don't know how this is going to work, but we're going to try it out, and it just worked really beautifully. I mean, we need to leave the names out and whatever, but can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we had a formulation that was really unique. There was some sugar involved. It was along the packaging side, and that was just really
Hmm.
really interesting because we really didn't know what to expect, and we ran through it and we learned a lot, and then we did it again and we applied what we learned from the first one, and the client was really excited, and the work continues. And so that kind of stuff is really really interesting when that sort of thing happens. And that was another one of those ones that it really caught us by surprise because by volume, by weight, the yield was really really low, but it's a product that potentially has a value that is incredibly high, so it makes sense to continue the work.
Well, then the flip side of that coin is, can you give us an example of when you ran a test and it just
I
went
can.
completely awry?
Yeah, well, we could talk about a lot of different ones that happened. The maple syrup was definitely a complete and total failure. But there's other things that have come in as a liquid that are just, the yield is just not there and you can't sell it for enough. And, you'd be looking at tens of $20 million investment to not make very much money. And that's just a tough sell at the end of the day. If it doesn't make money, what are we doing it for? When it comes to production and things like that. So
Hmm.
those tests have happened. There's been other things that you come in with an idea, but then it turns out that this product is fairly fragile, and you can't hit it with as much heat as you thought you could. So now the batch takes longer. Well, then that throws your whole prospectus off because you only have so many hours of production available, and now you're producing 50% less than what you thought you were going to do. So there's a lot of different things that all kind of have to work together to make it make sense. It's not just a single one thing that dictates all of it.
And it's good to have all of that data, good and bad, in hand before you try to sell it up the ladder and wind up investing a bunch of money in something that doesn't have a return for your company. So good
Yeah,
to know.
yeah.
moving on to the next slide, and moving on to the next point, we've been talking about test runs, but test runs don't always scale. So, Matt, can you give us a little idea of what does a pilot run prove and what does it not prove?
Yeah. Yeah. So prior to that step, we're dealing with a lot of unknowns. And what I like to refer to this as is now we actually know something. And then we can extrapolate it from there. We will
Mhm.
learn so much. And whether or not the run was successful or not, it's still learning something. And if as long as we're learning something from it, it was a good run. And at that stage, that's the mindset you have to have. We've had some where we run a certain product through there and the results were less than desirable. But we took that data and we thought, okay, well, maybe this pressure was too high. We can go lower pressure and regulate how much heat we're applying at the same time so that we can protect the product instead of forcing that moisture out so fast. Maybe we need to be a little bit more gentle. You
Mm.
start getting into things that we're dealing with enzymes or living organisms that need to be put into stasis to be reactivated later. That's when you start have to really digging into that as well.
And when you say that every run that gives you usable data is is a good run, even if it didn't turn out the way you wanted it to, how often are you working with a client who has that same approach?
That's a tough one to really pinpoint because like I think once you explain, well, let me ask you this just so I can clarify, like what percentage of clients do we need to explain that to? Or what percentage of clients do we get bad runs and have to learn from them and try again?
I was thinking more along the lines of clients who might get a bad run and they're just and it's like the end of the it seems like the end of the world because they put the money into doing this test run and
Yeah.
it didn't work out and all their technicians had done all of the calculations it should have worked.
Yeah. I would say that that doesn't happen very frequently.
Okay, well that's
At this level, it's a real exploratory level for a lot of people. So they're kind of in that whole same mindset that I'm using is like, hey, we don't know what we don't know, so we need to know something, and then we can talk
mm-hmm,
about it further. And that's kind of what dives into that. Every run's a good run as long as we learn something from it.
mm-hmm. Well, let's say a product freeze dries beautifully in a
Hmm.
test. What else do you need to know before saying, hey, this is great, let's go, we'll take this big machine and we're going to put it in the line and we're just going to run right ahead? What do you need to know before knowing it will scale
This is
as beautifully
fantastic.
as it tested?
Yeah, this is a fantastic topic. And like everything else, it's just a giant spider web of things to delve into. But primarily, we have so many discussions about the size of the freeze dryer to move the product through the batch system. And oftentimes people don't think about, okay, now how do I handle this much product to make sure my freeze dryer is full every day? Now that the freeze dryer is full every day, how do I handle getting it out of there, getting it through QC? What are my SOGs and GMPs to make sure everything is validated and everything has a traceability report after the fact? Do I
Hmm.
have the packaging equipment? Do I have the bodies I need to do the prep to get the system ready? Everything starts with the freeze dryer machine, and it's like, okay, we've got the budget for this. Let's go. And then all of a sudden, well, what about? So there's a lot of what abouts, I guess is a good way to put it.
I'm going to remember that phrase because that's a good one. Um, let's move on to the next slide. AJ, thank you. So, what should a manufacturer anticipate about moving from a closely contained, if you will, test operation into real world industrial production where I think that's where all our whatabouts are probably embedded.
Can you clarify that for me? I got lost in the middle there.
My
Sorry.
apologies. So you have a client and they've done a test operation. This is sort of idealized conditions, moving it into a plant with all the conveyor belts and the other elements of production. Um, what should a manufacturer anticipate about that shift? And it's not just buying the equipment. And this, like I said, this is where your whatabouts, I think, all
Yeah,
come into play. But there's also
yeah,
just the simple fact of moving into a real world. There's all sorts of unanticipated issues. And when you're talking about a real plant doing real product in real time with real people.
yeah. So it's just making sure you don't leave your blinders on is the key thing to that, because there's so many different things that are all going to be happening before and after. And each different product that you do is going to provide its own unique challenges. If you're dealing with something that's a liquid, you need to think about, okay, I've filled all the pans, I've filled all the product into these pans, but it's still liquid and I need to pre-freeze this now. So maybe you needed to think about filling the pans and then using an IQF and then putting them in the carts to move them into the freeze dryer. You know,
Mm,
if you're dealing with solids, how much time is it taking to get from A to B inside your facility? How many times are you moving that product unnecessarily? Is your flow right? Does it go right from receiving to freezer to freeze dryer? Or is there issues taking place where people are going back and forth when it should have been set up in a certain way? So, there's no real easy button as much as everybody would love one, but it's just you got to really kind of take that step back and constantly keep an eye on the big picture while you're doing all of your planning so that you don't find yourself with a bottleneck that you can't remove.
where that we all could have an easy button for everything.
Right.
Uh, One of the greatest marketing advertising campaigns ever, I think.
Yeah.
It, so, and talking about putting this into a real world situation again, what considerations need to be addressed regarding how the freeze drying process fits into existing equipment? I mean, every plant is different, but are there
Yeah.
general issues that can be anticipated in connectivity, for example? And you
Yeah.
mentioned timing and flow through.
So we work with a lot of different types of people, and we've done groups that are currently operating an entirely different line, but a lot of the components of that line allow them to add freeze drying as an additional value add to their entire product line. They're adding a new SKU. So they already have some of the things they need, like the freezers, the dicers, the packaging equipment already for their other SKUs. Now they want to add a freeze dry line. It's pretty easy to integrate as long as you've got the square footage and the available manpower and labor you know, to do it. Um, Other groups, they're starting from scratch. And then you've basically just got a nice floor plan. And those ones you can really just kind of figure it out and lay it all out there and come into it with really
Mhm.
good plans. So there's a couple different ways that it can be handled.
Okay, so i- is it possible? Is it easy? Is it doable? I guess would be maybe the question to say that all of this can be integrated into everybody's excited about artificial intelligence systems that can
Oh
do,
yeah.
more planning, more anticipatory maintenance,
Yeah.
quote unquote, see the problems before they arise. Is it easy to integrate all of that
Yeah.
together, including the freeze drying element of it?
Yeah. So these systems are pretty smart. They're very intuitive, and there's a lot of data points that these systems have.
Right.
And Parker, we have programs in place so that we make sure that the operators know how to read that data and what they can
Hmm.
do with that data. AI is an interesting topic because I mean everybody wants to invest in it, everybody wants to be a piece of it, and right now the data points, the key thing is just for traceability and whatnot, just start saving all these data points because eventually these AI agents are going to be smart enough to help you with recipe development based on previously provided data. Same goes for optimizing your scheduling, for smart scheduling, for batch timing,
Right.
things like that. All of that can be worked into it. And we work really hard as a company to make sure that, our operators from the labor level all the way up to the managerial level, and then everybody in between from an R&D standpoint and product development standpoints and operations standpoint. We want them to be able to read the story that
Hmm.
the machine is giving them so that you can continue to make good decisions on it.
Yeah, those AI systems can work wonders, but it takes a long time to train them on the
Right.
data.
I mean,
And
it's much like freeze drying. It's garbage in, garbage out. It's only going to do what you tell it to do with the information you let it have. And and so it's very important that, you're controlling that data and you're not giving it bad
hmm
information to make poor decisions with.
hmm Terrific. Let's move on to the next slide because I think it's time we can like talk about some spreadsheet work here. And the financial inputs that need to be considered before making this investment.
Yeah. Yeah, this is great. So on the left side of the slide here, we've just got a couple of key things that you want to keep a focus on to help you understand what your real costs are. It's not just the cost of the equipment. There's a lot of different things that need to vary into it. So I'll throw in a little plug for our website. We do have a calculator available on the website that you can add in a few different things like what is the cost of my raw material? How much do I want to produce? And what is the yield of my raw material? That'll help you answer some of these questions. Then you take that information and plug it in with, okay, what is the cycle time for this product? And we learned that through our pilot batch, through our test
Hmm
batch. What is the throughput? How much can we process? How much do we need to meet our goals? And how many machines is it going to take to get there? And what size of machines is it going to take to get there? The handling. Okay, we've got bigger equipment. So, what are we bringing in? How often are we bringing it in? How long do we need to store it before we can freeze dry it? What do we do with it after the fact? How do we get it to shipping back on the truck and out the door or to
hmm
my retail location or through e-commerce or whatever? Utilization, how often is the equipment running? How efficient is your entire operation going? Are you dealing with any kind of downtimes? And lastly, the labor side of things. How many people am I going to need to make this all run smoothly? So you have to take all of that into consideration. It's really just that whole big picture. It's not just the size of the machine.
on the labor side, and this is often a hidden issue in any kind of production facility, but I mean, i- when you're adding this type of technology to your process, is this the kind of technology that you could take a line worker and put them through a training process and then put them in charge, or is this a need for on the technological side, somebody who really has a head for computers?
We typically the program system, the operating system is very intuitive, and there's a handful of buttons. At the end of the day, we're controlling three things with freeze drying. We're controlling air pressure, temperature, and a phase of matter. So the way I like to explain it is that at first glance, it looks like the Matrix. It's ones and zeros. It's green dots flying all over your screen. And by the time you're done being trained on it, you understand. You see the picture. You see the story being told to you about what's
Hmm
going on. So who can do that? We typically are going to see a facility of scale is going to have a handful of labor. Okay, and they're going to be moving product from A to B. They're going to be loading and unloading, and then they have a handful at the operations level, and those are the ones that know how to program the machine based on the data that their product development and their research and development recipe development group gave them. They get handed the times and the temps to plug into the machine, and then all that data goes back and forth and they optimize that run from there. Once they've got everything dialed in, it's completely repeatable at that point, as long as you don't change any of your inputs. So I've seen some groups that are smaller that one person handles almost all of that. And then I've seen other groups that are much larger, like in the previous slide where you've seen all of the rows of our large Parker 10R systems. More systems, you just need a few more bodies. So there's different levels for a group like that. Everybody kind
hmm
of has their role.
Yeah. And that is an important consideration these days. Uh,
Yeah.
do you find when you're installing this new capacity, if freeze drying is brand new to you, do you find that putting it all in at once or doing some sort of staged capacity approach works most of the time?
It it's really case by case, Lisa.
Hmm,
Some operations are expanding an existing facility, so
right.
they kind of already know what's going on, so they can turn on a whole bunch of machines all at the same time, and here's capacity. Other groups are in that growth stage and still kind of figuring it out, so they operate a little slower. And the funding of these projects also has a lot to do with that too. What's available to them and how fast is their growth plan. So it can be done both ways. It just really matters where you're at, and we try to meet you there, is what it comes down to.
Yeah, I see. Sometimes I understand that you would might recommend somebody consider co-manufacturing with sort of a freeze-dry toll operator.
Yeah,
Um, and is there sort of a rule of thumb or certain elements of the proposition that make them ripe for looking into a co-man situation, or does it really vary across the board?
it's all over the place. The toll situation is really wild right now because of some recent mergers and acquisitions that took place that kind of turned toll processing on its head. An incredible amount of groups suddenly have to find a new source for that. So, um,
Wow.
yeah, so we're seeing some ripples of that in the industry, and there's a lot of interest in people that were toll processing are now starting to make the decision that, what, my brand is where it's at right now, but I'm not comfortable with outsourcing anymore. I need to control this and I need to become vertical. So some people that makes sense for them as that's an option. For other people, they just need to find a different toll processor and they're at the mercy of what the market is going to give them as far as what's available. So there's no right or wrong way to handle it. It's just, what do you want to be responsible for
Hmm.
as a producer? I've got groups that use toll processing, and they are toll processors, and they send the material back out bulk to wherever it's going, and then that person there does their own packaging and
Oh,
at their own place. I've got other groups that are basically just marketing groups that have a brand and they don't actually ever touch anything. So
right.
it's a big space and it's full of a
Hmm.
lot of different ways to go about it. It just really depends on what your needs are as a producer or as a brand, or what you're trying to do.
I see.
Yeah.
Oh, well, let's move on to the next slide because you have a great schematic here for walking through the decision-making process, a little bit of that spider web that we've been talking about. So can you walk us through this decision matrix?
Yeah. So let's start with the process flow and let's just
Hmm.
kind of quickly talk through, because I saw a question come through that came in about that process flow thing. So you've got prep. So you need to get your product ready. You need to pre-freeze it. Okay. That's part of the prep. Then you go into the freeze drying phase. The batch time, depending on what your product is. I've got some products that are 16 hours. I've got some products that are, 76 hours. It really just depends on what you're working on. After that's done, quality control, quality analysis. Once it passes through there, you got all your traceability, all your validations done that you're trying to do, then packaging, and then B2C, B to distributor, whatever happens after that. So operationally, to get all this to work together, what's underestimated? Training requirements. So, what do we need to know? Do we have a water activity meter to make sure that we're within the spec that we want for our products? Do we have process controls in place so that if something changes, we can easily adapt? Scheduling and planning. Is our supply chain reliable enough that we can uh, receive the product in a timely manner so that we can continue to keep the freeze dryers running all the time? Downtime is bad. You want these machines running nonstop. Planning and documentation. This falls under the process controls, but it's still kind of its own part of the spider web. What's your guidelines, your SOPs, your SOGs? I like SOGs because they're guidelines, because not everything is black and white. SOPs are sometimes necessary where it has to be this way all the time.
Hmm.
Validation, that's another one. Compliance. We all know how everybody likes to, well, not, I shouldn't say it like that. Validation is important because things can come back and you need to be able to prove that you did everything you were supposed to do. So validation compliance is really good there. Change control. What say your formulator can't get a certain ingredient anymore, or you've decided to change your formulation. Your production team's going to need to know that because that may have an effect on the batch time. It may have an effect on the temperatures that you're using in your freeze dry process. Timeline, expectations versus reality. This is a good one because people just think, okay, I have this machine and I can do this many pounds and I can do this 365 days a year. No, you can't. You have to have downtime for maintenance. You have to assume that your team is going to go on a holiday once in a while. So you have to that's the reality of it. So you keep that in mind when you're working through your budgetary numbers. Um, we talked about this a little previously as well, but I'll hit it again. The integration challenges upstream and downstream.
Mm.
Can we get our raw materials? Can we get enough of them to keep the machine full? Is the formulation good so that we can optimize this entire process? And then downstream packaging, quality checks, and storage. And one thing we should also just kind of briefly mention when it comes to freeze drying is you brought it up at the very beginning, the downstream benefits. And we haven't really talked about it in a slide or anything like that, but you're shelf stable. You don't have refrigeration needs anymore. That has a ripple effect on your energy costs, on your storage costs, on your shipping costs because it's less weight. You no longer need reefer trucks to move things around if you were
Hmm.
previously just doing a frozen product or not dehydrated all the way and not completely shelf stable. So there are benefits downstream that really have nothing to do with the freeze dry process that you get to take advantage of because you've decided to go this route.
And making those calculations is certainly important, and I hope for most people uplifting. Uh, but you have a note on here on your slide. It says patience pays off, which, often in business, patience is not rewarded. So
Yeah.
this is an important consideration. I figured I would point that out.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
so where in this spider web is a client most likely to get tripped up? What are they most likely to miscalculate, misunderstand, overlook? Um, you mentioned the timeline expectations versus reality, but what do you most often find yourself explaining to prospective clients?
It's a little bit out of our scope, but the integration challenges with other processes that we don't really have anything to do with tend to come up a lot.
Mm,
Understanding what kind of equipment is it going to take to keep this thing full, and what kind of equipment is it going to, or what kind of labor power is it going to take to handle all this now that we've got all this capacity?
interesting, because
Yeah, I
it's
mean and there is a little bit on the optimization side because you don't you're hardly ever starting with the recipe you're going to finish with. It takes a little bit of time to dial it in before it it's repeatable.
okay. Good to know. Um, on this next, we can move on to the next slide. And I'm looking to sort of, sum this up a bit, and perhaps you can walk us through, the three steps to deciding whether a freeze
Yeah,
drying system is a good investment for a manufacturer.
yeah. So basically, what you need to go through first is the can we, okay? And the can we is can we even freeze dry this? Does it work? And once you've figured that out, then you get into the should we's. And that's where these three bullet points really come into play. Does the margin support it? Use the calculator on the website. Toss in the numbers that you know for sure. Compile that with what you know about your ancillary processes and ancillary costs that don't really have anything to do with freeze drying, and then figure out does the margin support it? Yes, okay. Can operations
Hmm.
support it? What else do we need? Do we need a bigger building? Do we need more people? Do we need a bigger freezer? Do we need a bigger slicer, dicer, what have you? Yes, okay, we can move on. And can it happen consistently? That's on the operations side of things of planning and scheduling. Can we manage this flow chart? And what happens if one of the answers is no? Where do we go from there? So you get those three things in figured out in the could we part, or I'm sorry, should we part, and then you've got yeses, can we, should we, yes.
Okay. That's a good way to walk it, just see it in a very linear sense. If you're more of a linear thinker like I am, instead of these matrices, which can be tough to follow. Matt, I'm going to go on to our to some of the questions that have been posted. Again, if you have a question, just stick it in the chat. But I want to ask you, Matt, if there was anything that we haven't discussed yet that you think, and I think we've covered a lot of ground, but if there's anything that we didn't discuss that you wanted to make sure that you mentioned.
Yeah, no, we covered a lot of different stuff here, and these conversations, this is just the start of it. So I do believe my contact info will be available, and I encourage you to reach out for more questions. We'll get through as many questions as we can while we have time allotted today, but we're here to help, and we're here to answer questions about this sort of thing. So let's go.
Perfect. Let me ask first. We talked about you want to make sure that you have the product that you're trying to freeze dry is has enough value, will at the end of the road have enough value. So how do you know if your product that you're considering freeze drying has enough value to go down this road?
Yeah, it two different ways to start this. The first question you need to ask yourself is somebody already doing it? So do I have a reference point? Do I know what this is worth on the market? Will mine be better or worse than this one? That's one of the things. When you get into stuff that is completely new and nobody else is doing, then you've got a little bit more figuring out to do, and you got to kind of understand what can I get for this, because
Mhm.
something is only worth what someone will pay you for it, no matter what you're asking for it. So at the end of the day, you need to take those considerations into play.
Can somebody really rely on sort of existing marketing research out there that might touch on what they're looking to do, or is this really a matter of, hey, you know what, go have somebody go out and ask two or three questions to a panel to get an answer for whether they think that your idea is a good one or not?
You could handle it either way depending on what it is. Like, kind of goes back to, though, is it something that's already out there and there's
Hmm.
market data available, or are you a trailblazing ground, breaking ground in something new, and then you do have to kind of bootstrap it a little bit and ask around and just kind of get a feel, and you can look at things that are similar to kind of help you out there too. um, not everything needs to be exactly the same to be relevant data.
Sure.
Some things behave similarly when it comes to, if you're trying to figure out your costs. Uh, we know that this product is very similar to this product, so that kind of gives us a starting point on what we think we can, how fast we can process it.
It's always marketing research is always interesting because uh, my favorite quote, which has been attributed to Henry Ford, is if I'd asked the people what they wanted, they'd have said faster horses.
Yeah,
When you're trying to roll something out that is unique, which is, obviously the goal, then you also there's always some sort of customer education involved. And so it's kind of tough to know whether sometimes these new ideas are going to be embraced or not.
yeah.
Well, here's more of a technical question. Sugar is difficult. No, actually, that was not the question. That was an explanation. Thank you for that. The question is, if sugar is difficult to freeze dry, can freeze drying be combined with some other form of drying, like do some dehydration before trying to freeze dry it?
There are some groups out there that are experimenting with combining different methods and doing like a finish of freeze dry versus, they start with a traditional method and then a finish of freeze dry.
Hmm.
Um, anytime you're looking at other methods, you're dealing with higher temperatures. And higher temperatures are going to lead to denaturing of the product. So you really have to make sure that combining two different types of dehydration, does that make your original goal difficult? Like, was your whole point to have a completely, you know, no denaturing, very highly nutritious, not a lot of decay product? Well, then suddenly, well, okay, we're only going to turn it up to high heat just for a little bit, but then we're going to freeze it. Well, the damage might already be done at that point. So, um,
Hmm.
I don't see it a lot out there, but I hear people talk about it occasionally. You just have to make sure that it doesn't deter from your actual goal in the beginning if you're going to go down that path.
Falls under the maybe you can, but should you
Right,
question.
right.
Another question. So, we've spoken about freeze drying chicken breast and the downfalls of trying to do that, but what about ground beef, which is
Oh,
taking
yeah.
off in the market? Uh, does that freeze dry well?
Yeah, so I want to make sure that I'm clear. We can still freeze dry chicken breast. You just don't want to put a whole one in there because it takes too long.
Right.
It'll still get done, but it just takes a really long time. But if you were to take the same one and cut it up into small pieces, then your batch time is exponentially shorter. So that's what I meant by that. Now, ground beef
I
is
see.
another good example. It's basically an incredible amount of surface area. So you lay it out flat, and you've got a lot to work with. The molecules of the water have plenty of opportunity to escape. There's no skin holding it in. So that freeze dries incredibly well as also.
Does it have to be spread out to be appropriately freeze dried, or can it go in like someone ground beef is often just packaged, rolled up in a ball of some sort, and can that work?
It can, but it'll take long, just like the chicken breast. So what's happening is, let's just talk about a ball of meat. Okay.
Okay.
And when the freeze dry process is applying heat, it starts on the outside and it works its all the way to the center. So the less distance there is from the outside to the center, the more optimal the process is going to be, because it's using conductive and radiant heat. With our systems, the way they're designed is conductive and radiant heat that has to work all the way to the center of the product to get that moisture out of the center. The outside
Mm-hmm.
will be freeze dried much faster, but you'll still have wet in the middle. So the bigger that ball of meat is, the more challenging it becomes to get all the way to the center of that thing. So that's why we want to see you spreading it out so that it doesn't take as long to get to the center.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay. So, the next question, we touched a little bit on pathogens that if you freeze dry a product, you've taken most of the moisture out of it, and so that really alleviates or inhibits the growth of all sorts of microbes. Um, but do you have data in terms of the effect that freeze drying has on pathogens and microbiology and
Yeah.
potential contamination?
This is almost an entirely another webinar.
Okay.
So here's what I'll say about that, because there's a lot of information to share and there's a lot of innovation taking place with this. Freeze drying is designed to preserve things, and when we talk about pathogen controls, we're talking about not preserving things. So um, if we're just going to remove all the water activity, there may be a very, very minimal log reduction that just takes place just because of the process, but not to the point where people are always shooting for that 5, 6 log reduction when it comes to these things. Um, so there's different ways you can get there. You can get there by adding another process involved. HPP pairs really well with freeze drying
Mm,
when the product makes sense for it. There are other methods, irradiation that you can use. There's phages that can, be installed into your formulation to help provide log reduction. But ultimately, to actually perform these kill steps, there's it's temperature. So there are groups that are achieving the required reductions in their processes, in their SOGs, and in their SOPs. there are an incredible amount of variables in play from product to product. So they have to figure it out. And that's not necessarily public knowledge once they do figure it out. And I believe there's still a lot of talk about validation when it comes to this sort of thing from the
Hmm.
regulatory agencies. But because there's so many variables from process to process to process, it's proving challenging to just apply a blanket rule like we have with 160 degrees for 30 minutes when there's moisture present. So, can it be done? Yes. The people that are doing it aren't typically sharing how they're doing it because it's their process they figured out for their product. But we know it's taking place out there. It just takes a little bit of legwork to get there.
Got it. So is the freeze drying process, is that appropriate uh, to be used as some sort of validation step or not?
Well, so there's data that the machine will give you of what was achieved during the run. So, from a traceability standpoint, you can say that this is what happened during that run, but how you program that machine has a big effect on what happens there. So like there's groups that are doing it now that is where they're performing their kill step is in the freeze dry process. But it's not something that is just out there and shared with everybody on how they're doing it because it's different from one group's product, their formulation versus how another group is doing it with their formulation. The data is there, the machine can reach the temperatures it needs to, but you have to figure out how to get that step and then make it
Hmm.
repeat.
Is
There's no
there an
easy
example? Go
button.
ahead, Matt. I'm
I said, I
sorry.
said, we're back to the easy button. There isn't an easy button for that. And that's what everybody wants. But unfortunately, the reality of the situation is that there isn't an easy button. So you kind of got to figure it out. The machine parameters are capable of pulling it off if you figure it out.
Is there an example that you can give us without obviously mentioning names where you said, part of the freeze drying process was a contributing factor in taking a log reduction of X, taking it from A to B levels?
I don't think that I can really share any specifics on that other than
Mm,
that they know what temperature they need to get to and they know when to take it to that temperature.
okay. So question, does everything have to be pre-frozen before going into a freeze dryer?
Yes, I will say yes. The freeze dryer could freeze a product, but it would take so long, it would be a terrible investment to have the freeze dryer working as a freezer when you could be doing freeze drying with it.
Hmm.
It's a designed to be a vacuum chamber. There's no airflow. And for things to freeze efficiently, you need airflow. So, um, our best practice is always if you have a freeze dryer that can hold 2,500 pounds, you want to make sure you've got a freezer that can hold 2,500 to 5,000 pounds so that you're always pre freezing tomorrow's batch while today's batch is in the machine.
Oh, I see. Part of
Yeah.
that, yes, but that's a lot of planning.
Yep.
Um, what about how important is it, or how does one? Uh, Let me rephrase this. Um, is there a process for automating the accumulation of product prior to the freeze drying step in order to go from what might be a continuous process into the freeze drying, which is a batch process, and then moving it out? I mean, how does one does does the freeze dryer, does Parker, for example, offer a solution to taking going from continuous to batch to continuous? Are there other solutions for that?
It depends on the product that you're working with, but there's equipment on the market currently that fills pans. Okay, there's cobots and robots that can take those pans and put them into carts. You just have to, take the time to work with the right people. And we make introductions to groups in automation and
Mm,
other equipment providers. Parker Freeze Dry, we are 100% focused on freeze dryers. I certainly hope that someday we get into the realm of automation and things like that. But where we are at right now, we rely on our network that we've built through all of our customers and all the facilities we've been in to continue to introduce to more people. So it often comes up. We figure out, okay, this is the size of machine we want, and then prospect one, hey, this is vendor number, this is vendor two, and this is what they specialize in, and let me know how I can help. So the automation piece of it beforehand can vary from product to product. Are we dealing with a liquid? Are we dealing with a solid? What are the parameters that we need to stay in? But sometimes it's just a person that's handling it, and other times it's a series of different pieces of equipment.
Okay. I think we're running low on time to take questions, but that we'll take the ones that we have gotten in and haven't gotten to, and we'll pass them on to Matt directly, and I'm sure he will get back to you. Meanwhile, I want to thank everybody in attendance for your time and attention this morning, and certainly thank you, Matt, and Parker Freeze Dry for sharing your expertise with us today and to helping FPSA bring this webinar to you. Before you go, folks, please take a moment to complete a short survey that is going to appear when this webinar ends. Your feedback helps FPSA continue to improve its educational programming and to plan future webinars. I thank you all again for your time and attention, and I look forward to the next time. And thank you, Matt. I've had a great conversation, and I think our audience will agree that being flies on the wall was very useful.
Great. Thank you so much for having me, Lisa. Thank you to the attendees for hanging out with us. And please reach out with additional questions. If I didn't get to your questions, send them over and I'll get through them and we will make contact. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks very much.